My name is Elise Moran. I am 29 years old, and for the last 7 years, I have served as a captain in the United States Army, specifically within the 75th Ranger Regiment as a tactical intelligence officer. While my peers were building portfolios or buying their first homes in the suburbs of Virginia, I was breathing in the metallic scent of CLP gun oil and the scorched dust of the Mojave during grueling training rotations. But despite the rank on my shoulder and the scars on my knuckles, I am still nothing more than a military-grade disappointment to the woman currently adjusting her $1,200 Sennheiser GSP 600 wireless headset. My sister, Naomi, stood in the center of the Camp Brightstone demonstration mat, the midday sun reflecting off the polished surface of her $250 custom-tailored black Hayabusa GI. We were in the heart of Greenwich, Connecticut, at an elite youth development gala where the champagne flowed like water and the cheapest watch in the crowd was a $10,000 Rolex Submariner. Naomi's smirk was as sharp and professional as the blade of a Benchmade infidel, but beneath the surface, it was entirely fabricated for the benefit of the 150 high-profile guests circling the mat. "Why don't you show these people what that taxpayer-funded training is actually worth?" Naomi sneered, her voice echoing through the PA system with crystal clarity. "Or are you too scared to lose in front of a real crowd?" I felt the familiar heat of a slow burn creeping up my neck, a sensation I usually suppress during high-stakes briefings at Fort Benning. I have spent precisely 1,825 days trying to outrun the suffocating shadow my sister casts over this family. To our parents, Naomi is the gold standard, the owner of a boutique martial arts franchise that nets 7 figures annually by teaching the children of hedge fund managers how to throw a sanitized punch. To them, my service is just a loud, inconvenient hobby that keeps me away from holiday dinners and prevents me from marrying a man with a private equity firm. The humidity of the Connecticut afternoon clung to my skin, making my standard issue OCP uniform feel heavier than usual. I looked at the crowd, seeing the judgmental glint in my mother's eyes as she adjusted her Cartier love bracelet, her expression making it clear she expected me to decline and avoid embarrassing the Moran name further. Naomi knew exactly what she was doing. She was a third-degree black belt in a commercialized style of Taekwondo, decorated with trophies that cost more in entry fees than they were worth in prestige. She moved with a practiced cinematic grace, her feet silent on the high-density EVA foam mats that cost the camp $60 per square. I looked down at my boots, the soles worn from rucking miles of uneven terrain, and then back at my sister's immaculate appearance. The air was thick with the scent of expensive Jo Malone perfume and the ionized smell of the sound equipment. The silence of the guests was heavy, broken only by the distant chime of a silver spoon hitting a porcelain saucer at the refreshment table nearby. I realized then that I wasn't just standing on a demo mat. I was standing at the edge of a precipice I had been walking toward since I was 10 years old. Every holiday spent in the barracks, every missed birthday because of a deployment, and every condescending comment about my lack of femininity led to this moment under the unforgiving sun. Naomi wasn't just challenging my combat training, she was attempting to invalidate the only part of my life that felt real. My pulse was a steady 70 beats per minute, a rhythm honed by stress inoculation and the cold reality of my profession. I didn't need a $1,200 headset to be heard, and I didn't need a custom-tailored GI to prove my worth. The contrast between her performative strength and the quiet, lethal competence I had earned was a chasm that no amount of family loyalty could bridge. I took a single step forward, the gravel crunching beneath my boot, and felt the weight of 5 years of silence finally beginning to lift. This wasn't about the crowd or the taxpayer-funded training anymore. It was about the girl who was tired of being the shadow in her own life. The contrast between our lives isn't just a gap. It is a jagged, unbridgeable canyon carved by 2 decades of resentment and vastly different definitions of value. I currently live in a 600-square-foot apartment on base at Fort Bragg, a space defined by cinderblock walls painted a neutral, soul-crushing beige and the faint, permanent scent of floor wax and industrial detergent. My most prized possession isn't a designer handbag or a stock portfolio, but a $15 wooden frame from a local craft store containing a single, slightly faded photo of my fallen unit, taken just 3 days before an IED changed everything. My version of luxury is a 10-year-old silver Toyota Tacoma with 180,000 miles on the odometer. A truck that rattles when it hits 60 miles per hour but has never once failed to start in the freezing pre-dawn hours of a deployment notification. Meanwhile, Naomi has built an entire empire on the fragile foundation of her own ego and the desperate insecurities of suburban parents. She operates Moran Elite MMA, a polished glass and steel temple where she charges parents $350 a month for empowerment classes that are more about high-resolution Instagram photos than actual self-defense. She glides through the streets of Greenwich in a white 2023 Porsche Macan S, a vehicle she purchased with a $65,000 predatory loan that carries an interest rate high enough to make a loan shark blush. Yet she wears the debt like a badge of success. To my parents and her 500,000 YouTube followers, she is the golden child, the visionary entrepreneur who turned a black belt into a lifestyle brand. I, on the other hand, am the unstable sister, the one who supposedly struggles with the weight of the uniform. The irony is a bitter pill that gets stuck in my throat every time I see her face on a billboard, because the world conveniently forgets that Naomi herself failed the very same psychological evaluation I passed with flying colors years ago. She was deemed unfit for the discipline of service, her temperament too volatile and her empathy too shallow for the responsibilities of command. Yet here she stands, the queen of a fabricated realm, using her platform to cast me as the broken veteran while she profits from a watered-down version of the violence I have actually lived through. Every time she posts a video about mental toughness to her adoring fans, I think about the nights I spent staring at the ceiling of my Spartan apartment, calculating the cost of my silence. She thrives on the superficial metrics of likes and monthly subscription fees, while I find my worth in the quiet reliability of a well-maintained rifle and the unspoken bond of a platoon that actually knows what it means to bleed. Watching her now, adjusted perfectly in her high-end gear, I see the frantic need for validation that drives every one of her calculated insults. She needs this crowd to believe I am less than her because, deep down, she remembers the day the recruiter handed her the rejection letter and told her she didn't have what it takes to lead. I am the physical reminder of her greatest failure, and as she stares me down in front of these 150 wealthy donors, I realize that her empire is nothing but a house of cards held together by expensive branding and a desperate, driving need to prove she isn't the disappointment our father always feared she would be. The silence on the mat grew heavy, the air thick with the smell of freshly cut grass and the ozone of the PA system, as the reality of our two worlds finally collided in the humid Connecticut heat. The betrayal reached its boiling point at exactly 11:14 a.m., carved into the narrow, suffocating window of time between the final notes of the national anthem and the ignition of the industrial-sized stainless steel Napoleon Prestige grills for the afternoon barbecue. Naomi had not merely invited me to this gala under the guise of sisterly reconciliation. She had meticulously orchestrated an ambush designed to dismantle my professional reputation in front of the very people whose opinions my parents valued more than my life. Standing just behind her was Zane Porter, the head coach of Moran Elite MMA, a man whose career should have ended years ago if not for two ironclad non-disclosure agreements and a $50,000 private settlement following a brutal training scandal that the local media was paid to ignore. Zane stood there with a predatory stillness, his arms crossed over a branded compression shirt, serving as the silent enforcer for Naomi's calculated cruelty. One round, no punches, just grappling, Naomi challenged with a voice that carried the practiced cadence of a seasoned performer who knew the high-definition cameras were already rolling and capturing every micro-expression for her digital empire. As my boots touched the edge of the high-density foam mat, the air was a thick, nauseating cocktail of expensive charcoal briquettes heating up, the metallic tang of the sound equipment, and the floral notes of overpriced Chardonnay. I looked toward the VIP seating area and watched as my own mother deliberately turned her head away, adjusting her silk scarf and focusing on a speck of dust on her sleeve, her refusal to meet my eyes a more devastating blow than any physical strike. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the sophisticated hum of the elite crowd devolving into a primal rhythmic chant of fight, fight, fight that echoed like the bloodlust of a Roman Colosseum reimagined for the Connecticut suburbs. Naomi leaned in as we squared off, the scent of her minty breath and expensive setting spray hitting me as she whispered a final, jagged truth that only I was meant to hear. "This is for the 3 million views you are about to give me, sis," she hissed, her eyes gleaming with the cold, calculating light of a social media algorithm rather than the warmth of a sibling. I felt the vibration of the crowd's feet through the mat, a low-frequency thrum that matched the steady, lethal pulse in my own temples as I realized I was no longer at a family function. I was in a kill zone, A meticulously prepared environment where my sister intended to use my years of service as a prop for her own branding, turning my trauma and my training into a viral moment for a global audience of strangers. The sun beat down on my neck, the heat radiating off the black mat and soaking into my OCP trousers, as I centered my weight and let the noise of the crowd fade into a dull, distant roar. My name is Elise Moran, and as I looked into the eyes of the woman who shared my DNA but none of my honor, I understood that the rules of engagement had changed. This wasn't a demonstration of skill or a friendly sparring match between sisters. It was an execution of character, and for the first time in 1,825 days, I stopped trying to outrun the shadow and prepared to step directly into the light of the confrontation. The digital clock on the scoreboard flickered, the red numbers bleeding into the bright midday glare, marking the exact second that family loyalty died and the survival instincts of a ranger took its place. The engagement that followed was not a brawl but a masterclass in the cold, clinical redirection of force that they teach you when your life depends on efficiency rather than aesthetics. Zane Porter, a 215-pound monument to pure ego and overprocessed whey protein, charged at me with the unsubtle momentum of a freight train, his eyes locked on my center of mass with the intent to flatten me into the expensive foam. I did not plant my feet or square my jaw for a theatrical clash of strength. Instead, I waited until the very last millisecond, the scent of his synthetic laundry detergent and stale sweat hitting me, before shifting exactly 4 inches to the left. I did not strike him because I knew the cameras were hungry for a narrative of military aggression, so I simply let gravity and his own 12-mile-per-hour forward velocity perform the labor for me. The sound of his heavy, expensive cross-trainers losing purchase on the high-density EVA mat was followed by the wet, slapping thud of a man who had forgotten how to fall without a choreographed script. He hit the mat 3 times in total as he tried to regain his footing, each attempt more desperate and uncoordinated than the last, until he finally sprawled out in a tangle of branded athletic gear and bruised pride. There was no blood spilled on the pristine white surface and no visible bruises to justify a lawsuit. Just the hollow, echoing sound of a self-proclaimed master of combat losing his balance to a ghost. The previously raucous crowd of 150 donors went deathly silent, the only sound being the distant rhythmic clicking of a high-end digital SLR camera capturing his humiliation in 60 frames per second. I processed the tactical logic in my head like a cold, gray spreadsheet. If I had struck him, I would be the aggressive, unstable veteran they all wanted me to be, a bully who couldn't leave the war behind. By simply moving, I had turned him into a fool and Naomi into a liar, stripping away the carefully curated veneer of her elite training program in a single fluid motion. I did not look back at the VIP section to see if my mother had finally found the courage to watch, nor did I wait for the referee to make a formal call that would never come. At exactly 11:26 a.m., I stepped off the edge of the mat, my standard issue boots making a sharp final sound against the gravel as I walked away from the center of the demo area. Behind me, Naomi stood frozen in the harsh midday sun, her grip tightening on the $1,200 Sennheiser microphone that was now broadcasting nothing but the sound of her own shallow, panicked breathing and the rustle of her $250 GI. The narrative she had spent months constructing for her 500,000 followers, the story of the triumphant entrepreneur overcoming her broken sister, had been shattered by 4 inches of lateral movement and a refusal to play the villain in her digital theater. As I walked toward the parking lot where my 10-year-old Toyota Tacoma sat waiting, the silence of the elite crowd felt heavier and more honest than any applause I had ever received. I realized that my sister had been selling a fantasy of power to people who had never known a real threat, while I had been living a reality where power was measured by the ability to remain calm while the world tried to force a reaction. The air in Greenwich was still thick and humid, but for the first time in 7 years, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of the Moran family legacy pressing down on my chest. I turned the key in my ignition, the familiar rattle of the 180,000-mile engine a grounding symphony of reliability, and left the shattered remains of my sister's empire in the rearview mirror without a single regret. Family is supposed to be the ground you stand on, but I finally understood that some families are just quicksand dressed in designer labels, and my only job was to stop sinking. By 6 p.m., the digital execution of my character began with the clinical precision of a targeted drone strike, though the weapon of choice was far less honorable than anything I had encountered in the 75th Ranger Regiment. I was sitting in my cramped kitchen, the hum of my thrift store refrigerator providing a lonely soundtrack to the evening, when my phone began to vibrate with a frantic, unrelenting rhythm that signaled the start of a social media firestorm. Naomi had uploaded a 58-second TikTok video, a masterclass in deceptive editing that utilized aggressive cuts, a desaturated color filter to make my expression look predatory, and a heavy funk bass track that pulsated with a manufactured sense of impending violence. The caption, written in a bold white font that screamed for attention, read "Army Captain Humiliates Civilian Coach at Charity Gala," and within 2 hours, the algorithm had pushed it to 1.2 million views. She had taken the moment where I simply moved out of the way and slowed down the footage of Zane Porter falling, framing it so it appeared as though I had used an illegal combative strike to upend him while his back was turned. The comments section was a cesspool of outrage from her 500,000 followers, people who had never stepped foot on a deployment line but felt qualified to judge the conduct of a soldier based on a $15 editing app. The weight of her betrayal became tangible at exactly 8:14 p.m. when the blue light of my smartphone illuminated the dark room with a formal notification from the base command server. The subject line was cold and devoid of the nuance of my 10 years of service, stating simply that Captain Moran was ordered to report to Internal Affairs at 0800 hours the following morning for a suspected conduct violation unbecoming of an officer. Naomi wasn't just trying to win a petty family argument or boost her engagement metrics anymore. She was actively campaigning to strip me of my $78,000 a year career, my security clearance, and the very reputation I had bled to build. She was using a cheap mobile application to dismantle a decade of sacrifice, turning my tactical intelligence background into a liability by painting me as a volatile weapon capable of snapping at a peaceful garden party. I looked at the framed photo of my fallen unit on the wall, the $15 wood grain feeling like the only honest thing left in my world, and realized that my sister's empire was fueled by a specialized kind of malice that the army never trained me to fight. She knew that in the current climate, the mere optics of a uniformed officer appearing to bully a civilian in a viral video were enough to trigger a career-ending investigation, regardless of the physical truth. While she sat in her Greenwich mansion, likely sipping a glass of expensive Napa Valley Cabernet and watching her follower count climb, I was left to contemplate the ruins of a life spent in service to a country that could be turned against me by a clever edit and a trending hashtag. The contrast was a jagged pill to swallow, knowing that my 600-square-foot apartment might soon be replaced by the civilian world I had forgotten how to navigate, all because I refused to be a prop in her narcissism. I spent the rest of the night staring at the 0800 timestamp on my screen, the glow reflecting in my eyes as I prepared for a different kind of combat. One where the rules of engagement were written in the shifting sands of public opinion and the ruthless ambition of a sister who viewed my life as nothing more than content for her brand. The silence of the base felt oppressive, a vast contrast to the digital noise screaming my name across a million screens, and I understood that the fight on the mat was only the opening volley in a war Naomi intended to win by any means necessary. I sat in my dark kitchen, the only light emanating from the cold blue glow of my smartphone and the humming digital display of a microwave, staring into a $4 cup of lukewarm coffee that tasted of burnt beans and despair. I did not reach out to a high-priced defense attorney or a military liaison. Instead, I placed a call to a ghost from my past, a man who owed me a debt that transcended the boundaries of civilian law. Logan West had been a corporal under my command during Operation Lantern Echo, and I had personally dragged him through the smoke and broken glass of a collapsing warehouse in Telwyn while the world ended around us. Today he was working as a junior instructor at Moran Elite MMA, a man who had become increasingly disillusioned by the toxic culture of vanity and deceit that Naomi fostered in her glass-fronted empire. The vibration of my phone on the Formica tabletop felt like a detonator as a text message appeared from him, stating simply that he had the raw footage and the wide-angle 4K file she had desperately tried to scrub from the internal server. He confirmed the unedited video clearly showed Zane Porter lunging first with a focused, aggressive intent and captured the precise moment I utilized passive redirection rather than the strike Naomi's edited TikTok had fabricated. We met at a dimly lit 24-hour diner off Interstate 95, a place where the air was thick with the scent of industrial-strength degreaser and old coffee grounds, far away from the judgmental eyes of the Greenwich social circle. Across a table scarred by years of use and beneath the flickering hum of a dying fluorescent light, Logan slid a silver 64GB SanDisk thumb drive toward me with a hand that still bore the faint white scars of Telwyn. On a single grease-stained paper napkin, We began to meticulously map out the architecture of the truth, documenting the exact timestamps that contradicted Naomi's viral narrative and syncing the original high-fidelity audio that captured her whispering her malicious intent. We didn't stop at the footage. Logan provided a detailed list of Naomi's fraudulent safety certifications, revealing that her elite martial arts credentials were backdated and signed by a shell company she owned, a direct violation of state athletic commission standards. The contrast between the polished high-definition lie she was selling to her 1.2 million viewers and the raw, unpolished reality contained on that drive was a weapon more powerful than any rifle I had ever carried. I looked at the digital clock on the diner wall, the red numbers blinking 2:45 a.m., and felt a cold, tactical clarity wash over me that I hadn't felt since my last rotation in theater. Every second that passed brought me closer to my 0800 appointment with Internal Affairs, but for the first time since the gala, I wasn't walking into a slaughter. I was walking into an ambush of my own making. Naomi had spent $65,000 on a Porsche and $1,200 on a headset to project an image of untouchable power, but she had forgotten that the foundation of any empire is only as strong as the people you trample to build it. As I pocketed the drive and left a $5 bill on the table for the coffee I barely touched, the cool night air felt different, charged with the kinetic energy of a counteroffensive. I wasn't just fighting for my $78,000 salary or my rank as a captain anymore. I was fighting to ensure that the truth wasn't something that could be edited away for 3 million views. I climbed into my 10-year-old Toyota Tacoma, the engine turning over with a reliable rhythmic growl, and began the drive back toward the base, the raw data in my pocket weighing more than the armor I had worn in Talwyn. The war was no longer happening on a mat in the sunlight. It was happening in the details, in the timestamps, and in the quiet courage of a man who refused to let a lie stand, and I was finally ready to stop being the disappointment she wanted me to be. The reckoning unfolded on a sweltering Saturday afternoon inside the local community center town hall, a space that smelled of lemon-scented floor wax and the nervous energy of a neighborhood gathered to witness a spectacle. Naomi had transformed the wood-paneled room into a temple of her own making, decorating every available surface with $5,000 worth of high-gloss vinyl banners promoting her new anti-bully seminar, her face plastered 4 feet high with a manufactured expression of compassionate strength. She was wearing a new ivory-colored silk blazer that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance, holding a wireless microphone and basking in the attention of parents who were ready to hand over their hard-earned money to the local hero they had seen on TikTok. I did not enter the room as the broken, unstable sister she had tried to archive in a 58-second clip. Instead, I arrived in my full Class A Army Green Service uniform, my silver captain bars catching the overhead fluorescent light and my rack of medals polished to a mirror finish. Every ribbon, from my Bronze Star to my Army Commendation Medal, sat perfectly level above my heart, a testament to a reality that no digital filter could replicate. The room went silent as the heels of my polished black low quarters clicked against the linoleum with the rhythmic precision of a marching beat, my back as straight and unyielding as a cold rolled iron bar. Naomi's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting to the doors as if looking for the military police she expected to have already escorted me into oblivion. I did not raise my voice or adopt a combative stance. I simply walked toward the technician at the back of the room who was managing the 12-foot projection screen intended for her promotional highlight reel. I handed him the 64-gigabyte SanDisk thumb drive I had carried from the diner, my movements deliberate and calm, and spoke into the sudden heavy vacuum of the room. "I think you played the wrong file for the promo," I said, my voice carrying the natural authority of someone who has commanded 100 soldiers under fire without the need for a $1,200 headset. The technician, a 19-year-old kid in a branded Moran Elite MMA t-shirt, looked at Naomi for guidance, but the raw confidence in my gaze compelled him to plug the drive into the high-end MacBook Pro on the desk. Within seconds, the wide-angle 4K footage Logan West had rescued from the trash began to play on the massive screen, filling the room with the unedited truth of the gala ambush. The audience watched in a stunned, suffocating silence as the video showed Zane Porter, 215 pounds of calculated aggression, lunging at me with a clear intent to cause harm before I even shifted my weight. There was no funk music to mask the reality, only the crisp, high-fidelity audio of Naomi's voice whispering her plan to use me for 3 million views, a sound that cut through the room like a serrated blade. The timestamp in the corner of the screen ticked forward with mathematical indifference, proving that every frame she had uploaded to her 500,000 followers was a deliberate, malicious lie designed to facilitate a digital execution. I watched my sister's face drain of color, the ivory silk of her blazer suddenly looking like a shroud as the parents in the front row began to murmur, their hands tightening on the brochures for her $350 a month classes. The contrast between the woman on the vinyl banners and the woman on the screen was so absolute that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the town hall. I stood at the edge of the stage, not as a victim seeking pity, but as a captain of the United States Army who had successfully navigated an internal affairs hearing that morning by presenting this very same evidence. My career was safe, my $78,000 salary was intact, and my reputation was being rebuilt in real time by the undeniable weight of the facts. Naomi tried to speak, her fingers trembling as she reached for her microphone, but the crowd was no longer her audience. They were witnesses to a fraud that had been exposed by the very person she tried to destroy. I didn't need to throw a single punch to win this fight, because in the world of high-definition truth, a lie is a fragile thing that shatters the moment it hits the light. As the unedited audio of her betrayal echoed off the walls of the community center, I realized that the shadow I had been running from for 1,825 days wasn't hers at all. It was a ghost she had created to hide her own hollow core, and today that ghost was finally laid to rest in front of everyone she had ever tried to impress. The 70-inch Samsung high-definition monitor at the front of the town hall flickered to life with a crisp digital snap, but the images that began to fill the screen were not the polished, rhythmic TikTok edits the audience had come to expect from the Moran Elite brand. Instead, the raw and unedited footage of the Camp Brightstone ambush played out in brutal clinical clarity, stripping away the cinematic filters and the aggressive funk bassline to reveal the naked truth of the confrontation. The 100 residents of Greenwich watched in a suffocating heavy silence as the wide-angle 4K lens captured Naomi leaning in, her lips moving as she whispered those jagged, poisonous insults into her $1,200 headset just seconds before the spar was set to begin. The audio, uncompressed and clear, broadcast her cold admission of using my life for viral content through the community center's ceiling-mounted JBL speakers, the sound bouncing off the wood-paneled walls like a physical blow. They saw Zane Porter, her hand-picked enforcer, bypass every rule of engagement to execute a dangerous and illegal leg sweep attempt that was designed to break a limb rather than test a skill, and they saw me do nothing but breathe and move. But I did not stop at the physical evidence because a ranger knows that to truly neutralize a threat, you must dismantle its logistics. With a steady hand, I used the technician's trackpad to minimize the video and pull up a series of internal financial spreadsheets that Logan West had pulled from the back end of the Moran Elite MMA server. The screen filled with rows of damning figures and redirected transactions, specifically highlighting $12,000 in redirected youth scholarship funds that Naomi had funneled through a shell account to cover the monthly installments on her $65,000 Porsche Macan S. The crowd leaned forward as they saw the line items where money intended for underprivileged children's empowerment had been used to pay for high-end detailing and premium insurance premiums for a luxury SUV. The silence in the room became a pressurized wait, broken only by the sharp, hollow thud of a $15 reusable Yeti water bottle falling from a parent's hand and rolling across the polished linoleum floor. I watched as the local donors, the people who had written $500 checks thinking they were supporting a community leader, turned their gazes toward Naomi with expressions of curdled respect. My sister stood frozen beside her $5,000 worth of vinyl banners, the ivory silk of her blazer clashing with the sickly pale hue of her skin as she realized that her empire of ego was being liquidated in real time. I didn't need to speak, nor did I need to utilize the tactical intelligence training that had cost the taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars, because the data spoke a language that even her most loyal followers couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about a fight on a mat anymore. It was about the systematic exploitation of a community's trust to fund a lifestyle of predatory luxury. I stood there in my classy uniform, the weight of my medals providing a grounding counterpoint to the hollow vanity of her branding, and I felt the last of her shadow evaporate under the harsh fluorescent lights of the town hall. My name is Elise Moran, and as I looked at the shattered remains of my sister's reputation, I realized that true power isn't found in a follower count or a luxury car loan, but in the quiet, unyielding integrity of a life that doesn't need to be edited to be honorable. The red numbers of the digital clock on the wall hit 2:14 p.m., marking the exact moment the Moran Elite MMA franchise ceased to be a kingdom and became a cautionary tale of what happens when you mistake a sibling's silence for weakness. Family is about blood, they say, but standing in that room, I knew that family is really about the truth you are willing to defend when everything else is stripped away. This isn't a dojo, I told the assembled parents, my voice projecting with the steady, resonant authority I had honed through years of commanding 120 soldiers across 3 different continents and under the most grueling conditions imaginable. I stood at the center of the town hall, the fluorescent lighting reflecting off the brass buttons of my Class A uniform, while I looked directly into the eyes of the mothers and fathers who had been bankrolling my sister's delusions of grandeur. This is a theater, I continued, the words cutting through the stagnant air of the community center. And my sister is the only one getting paid for the performance you have all been forced to participate in for the sake of her social media engagement. Naomi's face turned a violent, bruised shade of purple that clashed hideously with the vibrant hue of her $150 limited edition designer leggings, her jaw working soundlessly as the carefully constructed persona of the serene empowerment guru disintegrated in front of a live audience. She tried to scream, her lungs drawing in air for a vitriolic defense that would surely involve more lies and deflection, but for the first time in her adult life her followers, the actual human beings standing in the room rather than the bot-inflated numbers on a screen, weren't hitting a digital like button. Instead, a heavy tectonic shift occurred in the room's atmosphere as the realization of her financial betrayal and the staged violence of the gala settled into the minds of the Greenwich elite. I watched as a prominent local surgeon, a man who had likely written a dozen checks to Moran Elite MMA, stood up with a look of cold, surgical disgust and firmly grasped his young son's hand, leading the exodus toward the double oak doors at the back of the hall. The sound of dozens of chairs scraping against the linoleum floor created a dissonant symphony of rejection that drowned out the hum of the high-end projector I had used to dismantle her life. These parents who had trusted Naomi with the physical and emotional development of their children, were now walking away from the $5,000 worth of vinyl banners and the empty promises of a woman who viewed their families as nothing more than a source of revenue for her $65,000 Porsche. Naomi reached out a hand, a desperate clawing gesture toward the departing crowd, but no one turned back to look at the queen of a dying empire. The silence that followed the exit of the families was more deafening than any explosion I had survived in the Middle East, leaving only the 2 of us in a room filled with the debris of a shattered narrative. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw only a terrified 31-year-old woman standing amidst the ruins of a house built on sand and predatory interest rates. The internal investigation at the base had already cleared me, my commanding officer had personally apologized for the temporary suspension, and my $78,000 salary was secure, but none of that felt as significant as the simple, quiet triumph of the truth. I had spent 1,825 days believing I was the disappointment, the unstable one who couldn't fit into the polished world our parents demanded, yet here I was, the only one left standing with my dignity intact. I didn't need to say another word to her, nor did I need to witness the inevitable bankruptcy filings and the repossession of the white mekung that would surely follow this public exposure. I adjusted the brim of my service cap, the felt smooth beneath my fingers, and turned my back on the stage, the banners, and the sister who had tried to trade my honor for 3 million views. As I walked out into the cool Connecticut afternoon, the weight that had been pressing on my chest for a decade was gone, replaced by the profound, unshakable peace of a soldier who has finally finished her longest tour of duty. Family isn't a brand and it isn't a transaction. It is the truth that remains when the cameras are turned off and the audience has gone home, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was without her shadow blocking the sun. The fallout from the town hall presentation was surgical and absolute, moving through the affluent community of Greenwich with the devastating efficiency of a brush fire in a high-wind canyon. By Monday morning, the internal management software at Moran Elite MMA recorded 42 immediate membership cancellations, as parents who had previously viewed Naomi as a mentor realized they had been funding a lifestyle of deception and ego. The local news cycle, usually preoccupied with zoning board meetings and high school sports, pivoted sharply by Wednesday when the evening broadcast ran a stinging 6-minute investigative segment titled Viral Valor: The Truth Behind the TikTok. The journalists highlighted the contrast between my unedited combat footage and Naomi's filtered manipulation, effectively poisoning the well of her public persona and leading her major YouTube sponsors, including a high-end supplement brand that provided her with $5,000 a month in passive income, to terminate their contracts with immediate effect. The digital silence that followed was broken only by the frantic, erratic vibrations of my phone on my wooden kitchen table as Naomi spiraled into a desperate reality she was entirely unprepared to navigate. She sent me 14 text messages in a span of just 3 minutes, a chaotic spectrum of emotion that began with vitriolic accusations claiming I had destroyed her life and shifted rapidly into pathetic, misspelled pleas for me to lend her $2,000 to cover the overdue rent on her boutique studio space. I sat in my 600-square-foot apartment, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across my worn linoleum floor, and watched the bubbles on the screen flicker as she typed and retyped her demands. There was no longer a polished facade or a $1,200 headset to hide behind. There was only the raw, ugly sound of a narcissist realizing that her social capital had been liquidated. At exactly 4:22 p.m., with the steady hand of a soldier concluding a necessary tactical operation, I opened her contact profile and selected the block option, severing the final digital tether that linked my soul to her toxicity. The weight of her absence felt lighter than any victory I had ever achieved in the field, a profound stillness that finally allowed me to hear my own thoughts without the static of her constant need for validation. I looked at the 180,000-mile odometer on my Toyota Tacoma through the window, thinking about the stability of my $78,000 salary and the simple, honest work waiting for me at the VFW basement the next morning. Naomi had spent years trying to convince the world that I was the broken one, the military-grade disappointment who couldn't handle the pressure of civilian life, but the surgical collapse of her empire proved that she was the one who lacked the foundation to survive the truth. As I set my phone down and began to prepare a simple dinner in my quiet kitchen, I realized that the 14 texts were just the dying echoes of a performance that had finally run its course. I didn't feel joy in her downfall, but I felt a deep, resonant sense of justice that no longer required her acknowledgement or her apology. The war was over, the battlefield was clear, and for the first time in 10 years, the only person I had to answer to was the woman staring back at me in the mirror. I breathed in the scent of the evening air, free from the ozone of her sound systems and the stench of her filtered lies, and embraced the beautiful, unedited silence of my new life. I launched Respect in Motion alongside Logan West without a single flash of a studio light or the presence of a single 4K camera to document our progress for a digital audience. Our new reality was housed in a 1,200-square-foot rented space in the humid, dimly lit basement of a local VFW post, where the air carried the faint, comforting scent of old floor wax, coffee grounds, and the heavy history of men and women who understood the true cost of service. We didn't have custom-tailored black GIs or $1,200 wireless headsets. Instead, we had a set of donated mats and a mission to teach veterans for free while offering local teenagers a place to learn discipline for a mere $40 a month. On our very first day of operation, the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs creaked open 15 times as 15 kids from the neighborhood showed up, their sneakers squeaking on the linoleum as they looked around at a gym that valued sweat over social media metrics. At exactly 10:05 a.m., the door opened one more time, and I felt a familiar tension tighten in my chest as my mother walked into the basement, looking entirely out of place in her tailored silk trousers and expensive leather loafers. She didn't arrive with the fanfare of a gala or a camera crew in tow. Instead, she walked toward me with a quiet, uncharacteristic humility, clutching a $20 bouquet of supermarket flowers wrapped in crinkling cellophane. She didn't offer a grand apology or a scripted speech designed for public consumption, but simply handed me the flowers and took a seat on the worn wooden bleachers that lined the far wall, her eyes scanning the modest room with a newfound clarity. I watched her from across the mats as she observed Logan showing a 14-year-old how to properly tuck his chin, and when I finally stepped closer to her during a water break, she reached out and touched my hand with trembling fingers. "I should have watched the whole video," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the industrial basement fan but carrying more weight than any of the accolades she had previously heaped upon Naomi. The contrast between this basement and the high-gloss empire my sister had lost was absolute. Yet for the first time in my 29 years, I didn't feel like the shadow or the disappointment. My name is Elise Moran, and while my sister was busy dealing with the repossession of her Porsche and the collapse of her digital kingdom, I was finally building something that didn't require a predatory loan or a deceptive edit to survive. My 10-year-old Toyota Tacoma was parked outside next to a row of bicycles, its 180,000-mile engine cooling in the shade, and my $78,000 military salary was being put to use supporting a community that actually needed me. I looked at the 15 kids on the mats, then at Logan and finally at my mother who was still sitting on those dusty bleachers, watching the daughter she had spent years overlooking. This wasn't the high-definition victory Naomi would have wanted, but as I stepped back onto the mat to demonstrate a basic wrist lock, I realized that true respect isn't something you can buy with $12,000 of redirected scholarship funds or a viral TikTok. It is a slow, quiet accumulation of moments where you choose the truth over the performance. And as the sun filtered through the small, street-level windows of the VFW, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The war for my reputation was over, and in its place, a new kind of peace had taken root in the most unlikely of places. Family isn't always about the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's about the people who finally decide to see you for who you really are, even if it takes a shattered empire and a grainy 4K video to open their eyes. Today the life I lead is defined by a profound and deliberate quiet, a stark departure from the manufactured noise and digital vanity that once threatened to consume my identity. I still climb into the driver's seat of my 10-year-old silver Toyota Tacoma every morning, listening to the familiar, reliable rattle of its 180,000-mile engine as it warms up in the crisp air of Fort Bragg. My home remains the same 600-square-foot apartment on base, a space that many would find Spartan with its beige cinder-block walls and basic government-issue furniture. But to me, it is a sanctuary of truth where every object, including that $15 framed photo of my fallen unit, has earned its place. When I walk onto the mats at the VFW basement for our daily sessions of Respect in Motion, my eyes no longer scan the perimeter for the glint of a smartphone lens or the positioning of a high-end camera crew. Instead, I focus entirely on the 15 pairs of eyes belonging to my students, searching for the moment a teenager finds their confidence or a fellow veteran finds the stillness that the world outside tries to steal from them. The news of my sister's collapse reached me not through a viral notification, but through a brief clinical update from Logan West, who still keeps an eye on the wreckage of the Greenwich social scene. Naomi's pristine white Porsche Macan S was finally repossessed last Tuesday morning, hauled away from the curb of a rented townhouse while the neighbors watched the very same woman who used to lecture them on empowerment crumble in the face of a mounting debt she could no longer hide. She has been forced to take a job teaching low-impact boxercise classes at a generic corporate franchise gym, earning a humble $18 an hour while wearing the same $150 designer leggings that now look like relics of a forgotten era. She no longer speaks of 3 million views or global branding, as the digital kingdom she built on a foundation of predatory loans and edited betrayals has vanished as quickly as a deleted post. I have found my peace in the very silence that Naomi hated so much, a silence that isn't empty but filled with the weight of integrity and the knowledge that I never had to compromise my soul to prove my worth. The transition from being the military-grade disappointment to a woman who is respected by her peers and her community didn't happen because of a viral video, but because I chose to stop participating in a performance that was designed to break me. Every time I adjust my uniform or help a student perfect their stance, I am reminded that the most powerful thing a person can do is walk away from a toxic dynamic that demands they stay small to make someone else feel large. I have reclaimed my name, my career, and my future from the shadow of a sibling who never understood that family is not a resource to be exploited for engagement. As I lock the doors of the VFW post at the end of the day, the cool evening air feels like a promise kept, a reminder that honor isn't something you broadcast to 500,000 strangers, but something you carry quietly within yourself every single day. My name is Elise Moran. I am a captain in the United States Army, and I am finally, irrevocably free from the theater of my sister's making. Family isn't always the blood that flows through your veins. It is the courage to stand for the truth even when the people who raised you refuse to see it, and sometimes, the greatest victory you can ever achieve is the quiet life you build for yourself after the storm has finally passed.